I'm glad I didn't remember 45 minutes in this time. Thank you. Okay, so now to the actual question. If you're watching online, you just missed a lot of introduction, but that's okay. Now we're at the actual question of the evening. This is the title of the talk. Can you be good without the existence of God? This is the question. It's the one we whiteboarded on. So think about it. Take 10, 15 seconds rhetorically. We're not going to answer it yet. But what do you think? What is your answer? And just why? Go through some initial reasoning. And make sure you understand the question correctly. Right, so at first glance, this question to many seems arrogant. It can actually seem like a pretty prideful question. And I've had, when we've done this question before, I've had multiple people on many different occasions. Granted, this is kind of, we're prepared for it, it's slightly built into the question. But I have multiple people come up to me and say, well, of course, an atheist can be a good person. Right? And how dare you say they can't? You think only people who believe in God are able to be good? I see atheists in my life, or people who don't know if God exists or not, and they do some of the best things I've seen. And that is great. That is not the question. Right? That is missing the point. The question is not, can you be good without believing in God? The question is just, is there such a thing as good, as evil, without the existence of God? That is the question. I hope you all see the distinction there, because we're going to be diving into this. But a lot of people answer this in a lot of different ways. So here's a sign. Are you good without God? Well, millions are. The good life without God, it is possible, from LincolnAtheist.org. And then this is one you might hear. Why believe in God? Be good for goodness sake. Right? It's kind of a mantra that I've heard around. And so people have very strong opinions on this question. Here on campus, we've done whiteboarding a number of times, and you see lots of different answers. So there's one from the past, and there's one from today, right, that Cole showed earlier. So there's a lot of varying opinions. So how do we kind of cut through the noise? How do we determine what's true in all the noise? What are the different reasonings? Well, that's where the actual argument comes in. And the classical argument has three premises. The first one is that if God does not exist, objective moral duties and values do not exist. 2, objective moral duties and values do exist, and therefore 3, God exists. So we're going to walk through each one of these in order. I'm going to talk through them and try and defend them, why I think they're true, and then we'll get again into objections. So premise 1, if God does not exist, objective moral duties do not exist. Okay? What are objective moral duties? Well, they're moral laws and obligations that apply to all peoples, regardless of things like time, location, your culture, your perception or opinion of them. Right? So if it is objective, if it is universal, truly evil, truly good, then it doesn't depend on these 4 things. It's outside of those. And I would say that it requires a universal standard. If you want objective morality that is outside of these things, you need a universal standard to appeal to. Well, why is that the case? Why do we need a standard? We need a standard always for moral meaning that we appeal to. So speed limits, right, are the perfect example. To say that you're speeding or going too slow, that means nothing unless you have the limit to apply it to, right? I need to know what is the actual limit to speeding. Is it 90? Is it 30? I mean, that changes everything. And I can't evaluate if you are speeding or not unless I know what the speed limit for this road is. We need a standard to appeal to and sort of a reference frame for all judgments on anything, even in science, right? In space, which way is up, down, left, right? You have to set it, right? If I say this water bottle, is it to the right or the left? What's your natural question? Of whose? Right, exactly. You need to know what reference frame to evaluate that. So if I say, is it to my left or right, that changes it. So you need something to appeal to make these judgments, and there has to be a good reason to appeal to it. So this is where it kind of differs from science. I mean, usually, right, in science, they're trying to pick the best reference frame you can. But even that is still somewhat subjective, so long as it makes the math work. I think morality is different. You can't arbitrarily assign moral value to something, or else we're back where it's not objective, right? Then it's just arbitrary. You've just picked it. But that doesn't objectively apply to everyone. We're not held under that. Which then leads to the question, well, if you need a standard to appeal to for moral laws and moral judgments, to call something good or evil, I have to appeal to something. Well, whose standard do we accept? There's been a lot of different standards to some degree throughout history. So here are what I think are the attributes required for an objective law giver. Here's the first one: total sovereignty or authority, supremacy. I think you need that because if everyone is going to be beholden to this system, it has to be from someone that has authority over everyone. Otherwise, why should I follow it? Right? What abstract principle actually makes me beholden to this system? That person has to have true authority over me. I think this thing has to be immutable and unchanging. Immutable is basically a fancy way of saying unchanging in some ways. I think that's important because then the morality isn't transient and changing, right? We can still maintain this objective standard. It doesn't change over time. Suddenly, now this is good. Well, if it's switched, then right, which one was right and which one had more value? And then we're kind of in this conundrum. We'll talk about that more in a second. But I think you also need total power. And this one is so that it can be enforced, right? If morality is not binding in any way, why do I have to follow it, right? If there's not actually consequences to what I do, it doesn't bind me. And there's no value to it. If I just instituted a bunch of moral laws to you right now, said because I'm the speaker, you have to do this and this and this, and everybody has to swap their left shoe to their right shoe as soon as it hits 7:37, and then 30 seconds later you have to swap them back, right? And I just started doing all this crazy stuff. Why are you actually under my authority? And why do you have to do it if I'm not going to enforce consequences? Or if there's no value to it, right? If it's not providing this sustainable good. And then lastly, I'd say immaterial. So I think, and I think this is a fair assessment, if you want moral value to be assigned, to be grounded in something, it can't be grounded in matter, right? I can't ground my moral value in a certain congregation or a certain way that atoms are organized. That doesn't make sense, right? That's just not the same framework. You need something immaterial to ground this immaterial value or substance in. So, looking at these, 4 principles that I think are fair to say you need these for an objective lawgiver. Who might possibly fill, these shoes? Of course, you already all know where I'm going with this. Right, I think there's someone who does fill them. Now, of course, I'm talking about God. I just threw that in because it's a very funny way to show it. But I think that God is the only one that can actually fill all of these. Actually, I'm going to go back. I think God is the only one who can truly fill all of these shoes, right? So that it can be grounded in an immaterial being with total sovereignty, total power. It's not arbitrary to appeal to, because if it appeals to Him, He created all these things from Him. He created us to be beholden to these values. I think that makes sense. That's a way to get objective morality, and I would argue it's the only way. And we'll talk about that more in the objections part of the talk, but I think this is the only possible source through which you could actually ground objective morality in, if it exists. So here's sort of the flow chart that helps me think about it. And if it doesn't help you think about it, you can just trash it, right? Don't remember this. But it helps me. I like to think about, well, if you want objective good and evil, true good and evil, that is not arbitrary and not changing, then you need an external law to appeal to. In the same way that you and I appeal, if I wanted to condemn you, I can't just say, arrest him because I said so. I have to appeal to what we're under, which is the US government, right? And laws from there. I have to appeal to this external standard. Now, that only goes so far, right? You get into an authority problem. Well, who says and what about in this part? And I don't think we get that problem with God. So if you want objective good and evil, you need an external law to appeal to. Now, if you want an external law, you need an external lawgiver. And the only external lawgiver that is consistent with what we need is God. That is the only plausible answer. And I think that's a very firm truth. So that's the flow chart that makes the most sense in my head when I'm thinking about this, when I'm talking about this. Now, I'm gonna go to premise 2. And if people need more time writing or anything, you can just tell me, or you can have me go back and talk. Premise 2, that there is objective morality. This is interesting. So we talked about, well, do we need objective morality and how do you get it? Now, is it actually a thing? This is William Lane Craig. Many of you probably recognize him. He's a very prominent Christian apologist. But this is his quote, right? Saying, I initially thought that the second premise, would be the most controversial part of the argument. In his debates with atheists and philosophers, however, atheist philosophers, he finds that almost nobody denies it, which is true. Surveys taken at universities reveal that professors are more apt to believe in objective moral values than students, and that philosophy professors are more apt to believe in objective moral values than professors in general. I'll be totally honest, I was very surprised by this. I was like, really? Isn't it true? So assuming his information is true, which I think we have probably good reason to assume it, that's a very interesting statement. That it is true. Very rarely do you find people who are willing to confidently say there is no objective morality. It's all subjective. It's all just kind of opinionated. And that's true. We see that on campus. So why do you think that is? Why do you think so few people are willing to concede that there is no, are unwilling to concede that there is no objective morality? I would say, here's the Christian view. Romans 2:14 through 15. It says, for when the Gentiles, which is basically all of us in this room, but it's the people who did not have God's law at the time, who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves. And even though they do not have the law, they show that the works of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness. And their conflicting thoughts accuse or try to excuse them on that day, when according to my gospels, God judges the secrets of men by Christ Jesus. So here's why I think very few people are willing to concede that there's no objective morality. It's because the law is written on our hearts. I think that we have been designed by a creator, designed by God, and he has put in each of us a conscience that knows these things. You know there's good and evil. You just do. Now, that conscience can be seared, it can be corrupted, so it's not this perfect, well, I exactly know what is exactly right. Like, no, but we all know that there is good and evil. And we also know that we've all broken our own standard for good and evil. Greg Kokel, another Christian apologist, says that deep down, people are certain some things are bad in themselves. And count on that. Count on that when you're having conversations. And that's true. When we're having these conversations, count on the fact that you and the person you're talking to know that there's good and evil. Though we may suppress that and I think intellectually convince ourselves that maybe there's not actually. And we'll talk about what that looks like. I think that people know this thing, and I believe that is why. But with moral subjectivity, if someone doesn't believe that there's objective moral values, what's the problem with it, right? Clearly, I'm making a case that we need objective moral values. So what's the problem with moral subjectivity? Well, here's the first main problem. The idea that morals are just relative to you and me. It's subjective to each person. It's in the eye of the beholder in some sense. The first problem is that you cannot condemn anyone or anything outside of yourself as being truly evil. You lose the power of moral judgments. We love to condemn evil. All throughout the world, you see people outraged at everything. All the time. People are saying, this is horrible. Turn on the news for 6 seconds. Right? You'll see it, right? We always are condemning evil. But if it is true that morality is purely subjective, I think we lose the basis upon which we can do that. Interestingly, many people today claim that it is morally wrong to impose your moral system onto somebody else and say that they're morally wrong. You see some of the problem there, right? There's a little bit of an inconsistency with that. You lose the power behind these condemnations. And I would say this, if you do make these moral judgments, which we all do, there's nobody who doesn't make moral judgments. I would say if it is a moral subjective system, how selfish of you. That is very prideful, right? To say that I have my system of morality, and that's equally valid as Cole's system of morality, but he's wrong, right? Or his is just worse, right? So I'm going to show him why his is worse and impose mine onto him. Yes, Cole?
What makes yours better?
It just is. I mean, it's obvious, dude. But, right, I think that's a problem. It is selfish to then say, I need to impose my morals onto somebody else. You're treating your own perception of the morals and what you decide on is more important than the serial killers. But how can you say that? Under what basis? Now, interestingly, you can't just not condemn someone else. You can't praise anything. You can't claim that something is truly good, right? That we really truly say this is an inherent good with value and there's a foundation for that. What you can say is, I personally agree with that and ascribe to that ideology. And which one has a little bit more weight? And this doesn't prove it, but when you think about it, which one has more weight? When a firefighter sacrifices himself for a child in a burning building, at his speech to say, now, Dave the firefighter, I personally, because of what I have been taught and what has been ingrained in me through societal norms and constructs throughout history, I find what he did to be a positive thing. And someone can disagree with me, and that is equally valid. If they say what he did was evil today, but I agree with what Dave did, and I will lift him up for it. Like, you lose all of the weight, right? Instead of saying what he did was truly good, always and forever, right? There is true value behind this thing that is not just from me or from you, right? It's bigger than that. It takes all of the weight out of your praising of things and your condemnation of things. So any moral judgments just lose their power. Additionally, what's good and evil can completely change, right? They can just change on a whim. One day this thing is great, and then in 100 years it could be awful, right? So the things that we're striving for is good and we praise each other for today, in 100 years people could look back and just say, well, that was actually very wrong, right? And we don't like that, and that makes it wrong, not just my opinion, but awful, horrible. So I think that's a problem, and I think you just don't have meaning or value to any good or evil anymore. Nothing really matters because now it's all just subjective. So where is the weight and the value behind these ethics coming from? I think moral subjectivity and moral relativism, as it has kind of grown and then diminished in America, and then kind of grown, I think in the attempt of trying to give value to all moral systems, it has stripped all of them of any value. I think I like this phrase, and I've said it a lot. I think there's many things that people believe and that we're told to believe, or when you think through, they're nothing more than just beautiful lies. That on the surface level, they seem really nice, and it's touching. And it seems nice to say, well, all of these are just great ways too, and they're just different ways of looking at it. But I think once you get past the surface, you see, wait a minute, this doesn't hold up. And in fact, you haven't given value to all the different moral systems, you've stripped all power from them because they conflict, and now none really have any meaning. It's just what I think and what you think, and they're both devoid of any power or anything behind it. So I think that is an important thing to look at when we're looking at moral subjectivity. But I also think here's another important point. It's just not livable. It's not livable with how we live life, what our emotions tell us, things like that. Frank Turek is another famous Christian apologist, and he gives a story of a student who turns in a paper, and who knows if the story is true or not. He tells it like it's true, so I'm going to assume it's true, but obviously I wouldn't think. But the point is, there's a student who turns in a paper at a university, and the paper is basically written on how morality is more or less a construct, how there's no basis for it, because he didn't believe God exists, but there's therefore then no such thing as fairness, justice, equality, right? These are constructs that we have created to live effectively, and it kind of had this pompous attitude of like, I've risen above it, right? Like everyone else sees these things as so important, and yes, they're good, or not good, but we need them, but I kind of see them for what they are, that they're just tools that we've created. And so the professor gave the student an F and returned it because he turned it in a blue folder, and he gave him an F and just said, I don't like blue folders. So he returned it, and the student was very upset. He was outraged. And so he returned to the professor and said, that's terrible. Like, you don't treat other students this way. You know, how are you able to do this? And it showed, right, the professor was making the point, you wrote this, but you don't actually believe it or live it. Right? The minute something unfair happened to you, you started throwing a tantrum about it. And so the question is, with moral subjectivity, if we really follow it to its logical end, is it livable? Do we actually live this? Or is it something we just intellectually convince ourselves of and then live totally, duplicitous towards it? So that's the question. I also think moral subjectivity really, in essence, is someone who's claiming to be lawful in a lawless land, right? If you're claiming to be good without God or an objective moral system to ground it in, you are claiming to be lawful in a land that has no laws. Back to our speed limit analogy, right? How can I say you're speeding or going under the law if there's no speed limit? You can do whatever you want, right? It's up to you. But you can't claim to be a law-abiding citizen if you just make up the laws, right? So I was talking to people whiteboarding today. It doesn't seem like there's really any weight behind it if I tell you guys, well, I have my own judicial law system that I'm under. And the only law is that on Mondays at 7 p.m., I cannot cross the Kansas state border. I just can't. And if I do, it's the death penalty. But if I don't, I'm a perfect citizen. I'm fantastic. Would you then be like, Luke, you're such a good person? Like, wow, like you are just an amazing law-abiding. Like, no, right? That has no weight. But I think that's what we're doing in moral relativism, is we're claiming I'm good and they're good and we just have our own systems. But there's no overarching law of the land, so why does that mean anything? What's the value behind it? What's the purpose behind it? I would argue there is none. There's no place to ground these things in. Kyle Nelson, he is an atheistic professor. He wrote this when writing about morals. Very brilliant man. But he obviously is writing this from a framework where he does not believe in God. But he said, reason does not decide here. The picture I painted for you is a grim one. It's not a pleasant one. And reflection on it often depresses me. That pure practical reason, even with a very good knowledge of the facts, will not take you to morality. So I think he realized this. He showed that without a God to ground in, because he was sure, I don't think there's God. That's out of the picture. He said, well, now I can't get to morality. Not a true morality that we're fighting for here. You can get to just make up constructs, subjective constructs in your mind, that's fine, but those don't actually mean anything. So that's his argument as well. So I'm not arguing, right, that the atheists and those who don't believe in God can't do actions that subscribe to a morality from a religious system, or even feel moral actions and feel the morals and outrage against good and evil, or even know they exist. I think most people do. I'm simply saying that if you don't believe in a God, you can't give an account for those morals. You might know they exist, and many do. You might be totally convinced, but you can't actually account for those. And I think we can. And so what do we say as Christians? Well, I say no. The answer to the question, you cannot be good without the existence of God. I don't think that makes sense. Like we talked about, it seems nonsensical to me. Isaiah 33:22 says, the Lord is our judge. The Lord is our lawgiver. The Lord is our king, and he will save us. So we have a lawgiver who has all of those required attributes we talked about earlier. And belief in God is not necessary for objective morality to exist. It's just that God is. So when we're framing this question, again, make sure we understand the question. We are just saying there has to be a God to ground these things in for objective morality to exist. And back to our little equation that I like, just in a different format. If you want there to be good and evil, actual good and evil, that are not just constructs or arbitrary, you need objective morality. If you want objective morality, you need a universal external standard or law. And if you need a universal external standard or law, you need a universal law giver who's above us, who's outside of humanity, who fits all these things. Now, I said we were going to get to the objections in the second half, but I do want to squeeze this one in real quick. It's called the Euthyphro dilemma. It's a very famous one. Many of you have probably heard this. It has two premises. It basically says, if something's good because God wills it, then that good is arbitrary. He just says, boom. Anybody who's in Kansas is now horrible and awful. Right? Boom. But that's arbitrary, so that's a problem. Or does God will it because it's good? Does he only create laws based off of what's good? Well, if that's true, then good is a value that's independent to God himself. And so we're back to this conundrum. So what do we say? Is there a solution to this? What's our response? What are our thoughts? What do you think? It's tricky. Yes, Cole.
Well, the first one is something good only because God wills it. I don't think the conclusion there is correct because, like, if God knows everything, then it wouldn't be arbitrary,
Okay. So trusting that he has proper reason to will something
right?
to be good. But then do we maybe get into the second one of, well, since he knows everything, he's only willing what would be good?
That's the question.
Right. And I would say, I think it's a false dilemma. God does not decree good arbitrarily. God decrees good because he is good. So goodness is defined as whatever goes in line or coheres to God's character. He himself is the definition of goodness. And if it's evil, it's whatever goes against his character. And if it's good, it's whatever goes with his character. So it's not that good is separate or independent from God. He is the goodness. And so whatever he wills will be good because it's from him. That is his character, and his character cannot change. We see that in the Bible. That's what God claims. He says the character will not change. He is unchanging. Okay? So, with that in mind, with the things we've talked about, let me throw this out. And this is very compelling to me. I'd say, so with all this in mind, if objective morality requires a God, and if objective morality is true, then God exists. But, in a sense, where do we go from there? And I would say, what is the ultimate example of morality? The perfect example of morality, as we're talking about objective morality. Is that such a thing? Is that a strange question? What do you think? What is the ultimate example of morality?
Is this the Sunday school answer?
Potentially. What do you think? Maybe I could phrase it as, who might be the ultimate example of morality? Right, so the Sunday school answer. Is that what I thought? It most certainly is. But I would say, all things that humanity sees and has seen throughout history as morally good and agreed upon throughout all cultures are perfectly exemplified in the gospel of Jesus Christ, in the cross. Now, what do I mean by that? This I hope you pay attention to this part, because this is powerful. I'd say love. Right? Everyone has agreed love is a good thing. It is a powerful ideal. Well, John 3:16, right? The verse everybody knows, for God so loved the world, right? He gave his only son. But that was the motivation for Jesus' whole ministry. To come down, to die, right? To suffer, to do all these things was out of love for those who were lost. And love for those who didn't love him back. Right? It wasn't like, you've done good things for me, so I'll love you. No, this was an unbelievable love towards us who were separated, who didn't want anything to do with him. Love towards those who would eventually kill him for it. What else? I'd say humility. Right? The opposite of pride. Philippians 2:5-11. You might recognize this verse. Though he was in the form of God, he did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant and being born in the likeness of men. And then, being found in human form, he humbled himself by being obedient, even to the point of death on a cross. So that's the ultimate act of humility. And I'd say this, even if you don't believe in Christianity, just thinking about the concept of this, I don't think there is any possible greater way to define humility. I would even challenge you. Try and think of a philosophical idea that would display humility better than God himself, infinite, eternal, all-powerful, stepping down to be a human in weakness and flesh, and then even going to the point of death, right? To live as a servant. That's what Jesus says, right? The Son of Man came to serve and to seek and save the lost. That is unbelievable humility. It's such humility that I don't think we can ever truly grasp it. I think we spend the rest of our lives getting at more and more as Christians of the weight of that, of the amazing power of that, right? Of the splendor of that message. That God would do that for me, the amount of hope in that is unbelievable. And I think it's because it's the ultimate example of that. Honor, right? Living a life full of honor. In Matthew 26:59, the account of Jesus being tried, right, and about to be put to death, the Pharisees, what did they have to do? What did they try to do to get him put to death?
False witnesses.
What was that?
They brought in false witnesses.
Right, so they bore false witness. They were making things up because they couldn't find anything. In Matthew 26:59, it specifically says they sought false testimony and they couldn't find anything to put him away with, is the paraphrase. But his life was above reproach. There wasn't anything really to condemn him on until, right? What did they eventually pin him on when he was crucified for? Well, blasphemy, claiming that he was God. Well, if he was, then still no problem, right? But the idea is he lived a life full of honor, such that everyone around him recognized it. Patience, right? Perfectly enduring so much. All the crowds constantly following him. If you read the gospel accounts, you're just amazed by it. It constantly is saying he woke up like before the sun and then went to bed super late that night because the people were just hawking him down. And he'd have to like try to escape. And he was constantly caring for people and loving them and healing them. But so much patience with the crowds, with his own disciples, with us still. So that's very interesting. And then lastly, sacrifice. Another ideal. And I think everyone would realize this is a good thing to strive for. And it's the ultimate sacrifice. Right? Again, like humility. I think it's the ultimate standard you could think of. And that's what the Bible says. Greater love has none than this, right? That a man laid down his life for his friends. That is the highest form of love in this sense. And Jesus was the ultimate sacrifice, dying for those who didn't deserve it in the slightest and never would. But that wasn't the intention. It wasn't because they deserved it, right? It was grace out of love. So I would say as Christians, not only do we have a way to account for morality, but I think we have the ultimate standard for it, displayed in Jesus. And I would challenge you, look at other religions and see, is there anything that meets this standard that can compare with the attributes displayed here? I think no. I do not think so. And I think it also means if objective morality is grounded in God, and if the ultimate example has been through the cross, then we as Christians trust that God's standard for morality and what he has said is better than what we think. And so again, we have consciences, but they're not perfect. And we don't have the full picture right now. So if things don't make sense to us, and there's certain things where it's like, well, why? Right? Why couldn't it have been this way? Or is this really that bad? Trusting that he is wiser, right? And the one who made the law and the system and is the embodiment of it, right? His nature, that he has the better plan. So now let's jump into some common misunderstandings. I heard a little chuckle, and it's because I have shown this slide before, and it was from when I was having so much fun using an AI art generator. And I wanted to see if you could possibly generate any man who is not very handsome and buff. And the answer was no. I looked up like 2 average attractiveness men talking, and it's still like very buff dudes. So that's all. But the point is, let's get into the objections. How should we respond? Okay, so here it's going to be some objections and some tips and some advice. So here's the first tip and advice. In Christian apologetics, again, how are we supposed to talk about these things? How should you discuss these things? Well, here's your first one. This is our main verse. Who's wearing the shirt? Who can stand up who's wearing the shirt? Isaac, turn around. Yeah! There it is. That's the verse. Thank you, Isaac. Well done. Good job. But 1 Peter 3:15-16, it says, "But in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that is within you, yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior may be put to shame." So here's our first thing. How do we respond? With gentleness and respect. If you don't have those, you're doing it wrong. Right? Take that in mind. If you don't have these when you're responding, you've lost. You've already lost the discussion, the debate, whatever it is. You're doing it wrong. Now, additionally, let's make sure when we're talking about these things, don't look past the question, do look past the question to the questioner. Don't get so caught up in the question, and I'm very guilty of this, but this is hard for me. Often, I want to just focus on the question, and is this right? Does it make sense? And no, here's the problem. Let's talk about this. And I forget about the person asking it. Right? Our goal is not just to factually disprove everyone who opposes us. It's to get to the person, right? To reach the person behind it, to care about them, to want them to know the truth, to love them, right? We're not after intellectual, lofty achievement. We're after people's souls. We care about them, right? So those are things to keep in mind when you're discussing. Additionally, the Bible says, right, if you have everything, but you don't have love in your speech, you are a clanging cymbal, right? Or a gong. You're a big clashing cymbal. It's nothing, it's just noise. So don't undermine the value of the message, of the content, by the poorness of the conduct. All right, don't do that. Make sure we have the right heart. But what's the strategy? When we're actually having these discussions, you're talking to somebody about morality, what's the number one rule of all apologetics ever? Ask questions. I did it in the wackiest transition I could find there, so that you wouldn't forget it.
What do you mean by that?
Oh. You're gonna be a star.
That's a
It's
question.
a prodigy. Right, so here's a statement that I like. Questions prod the heart, statements harden it. And that's true. And I just made that as a statement. I get to make statements tonight because I'm the presenter. But no, questions are important. They're crucial, right? Don't just, well, here's why you're wrong. Right, you're doing it wrong. You're hardening someone's heart. Ask questions. Get them to think through what they believe. And that's why questions are so important. They force someone to defend their stance and perhaps even consider it. I'm not saying that as a diss, but many people haven't considered their stance on a lot of these things. They haven't thought it through a ton. And so questions are good. Draw it out, right? Get them to think and to work through it. And some people are, they think out loud and talk, and I'm definitely like that. And so it's good to ask me questions and get me talking about it. And wait a minute, and hang on. Oftentimes they answer their own questions by talking. And so they're such a great way to lead people in that way. Questions often give the opposing side the burden of proof, right? You don't have to be under fire to prove every single thing about your views, right? Switch the burden of proof. If someone's very confident in something, make them prove it, right? Make them defend it. Does this add up? Does it have the evidence for it? And then questions also stop you from totally missing the problem, right? From just totally missing what someone actually is wondering or the problem that they're grappling with. If you just start spilling, oh, I know exactly what this person needs to hear, just blah, just like word vomiting, you might be totally missing the entire point and waste 20 minutes of both of your time. But if you ask questions, you can really get to the heart of the matter. All right, what's the disagreement? Where is it? How do we talk about this? Things like that. You can often demonstrate this entire argument, the moral argument, just through questions. If you just ask good questions, odds are you might not even have to make any statements, right? And additionally, like we said, most people haven't really considered how to account, especially students. When you're new to college and you're thinking through these big questions and all of a sudden you're independent of what your family thought and you have to think about, well, what do I actually believe? A lot of people haven't considered that. And so it's an opportunity just to ask them, to get them to think about them. So what is the role of apologetics? Again, more tips with just apologetics in general. Well, here's the phrase we often use, and a lot of you know this. It's putting pebbles in people's shoes. That's important to recognize. Realize the limit of apologetics. It is a tool, and it can only go so far, but it's a useful tool, and it's a powerful tool, right? It is asking questions and providing evidence and discussing and showing proper conduct that you're putting pebbles in the shoes of people with worldviews that don't make sense and don't add up, right? Have you done a hike with like a pebble of that size in your shoe? Like, it's unbearable. You can't stop thinking about it, right? Every time you take a step, you keep thinking about it again. I'm like, ugh. And that's our goal, right? Is to get people to think so that the next time they make a moral judgment on something, it's like, well, I did just say that wasn't actually wrong, right? Or something like that. Additionally, here's another way of thinking about it, another analogy that I like, and you might gravitate towards this one. I see apologetics from a Christian worldview as a funnel to the gospel. That's how I like to personally think about it. That some arguments are broader and more encompassing, and they don't take you maybe quite as far. And some are way more specific and narrow, and they get you right there. But it's all really a funnel. But that means you have to realize, what's the funnel for? What are you funneling to? Don't lose sight of what it's all for. And it's ultimately to get to the cross, the gospel, the most important message, the fundamental core of Christianity. But that's the important part. Not just to get someone part of the way. Yes, I believe in theistic God. As Christians, we believe in the end that doesn't actually avail you anything, right? That doesn't have value. Even the demons believe that God exists, right? So something up here might be like the ontological argument, right? The most basic It's just a way to get to God purely through logic, right? No like evidence or things like that. That is about as far up the funnel as you can get it. But it doesn't go all the way to the cross. Maybe, kind of. Depends how you approach it. But some other things like the historicity of the New Testament, right? The evidence for the resurrection, which is incredibly strong. That's like right there. So where would I list the moral argument? I'd kind of put it like here. It's very broad. It gets most people, but it doesn't get you the whole way, right? And you have to figure out how to get the rest of the way on your own. But that's okay, because the whole goal is just to prop open the door for the gospel. So know the tool you're working with. Different scenarios require different tools, right? We all know that, hopefully, as engineers. You don't take a monkey wrench to, I don't know, I can't even think of a good example. But a very wrong place to use a monkey wrench. Fill in the blank in your head. Okay, so objection time. This is what you've been waiting for. Here's some common things that you might hear, and many, actually all, that came up at some point today while talking. First one, what if morality is societal? Now do remember, as we talk about these objections, the point of this is to say, can these systems account for objective morality? I already talked about a little bit why I don't think subjective morality works, but the question is not that. The question is, can we get true objective morality, true right and wrong from these? So what's the problems with societal morality? What do you think? This is your time to share. Go for it.
If an entire society can definitely be wrong altogether, and it tends to be pretty horrible when it is. I'm thinking Nazi Germany here,
Right.
but also like our current society, we have some people trying to make acceptance of homosexuality like the norm. And what sort of horrible person are you for rejecting these people, for just being the way they are? And so they want to take society in that direction, and they're saying that the way our society has been and was 100 years ago is absolutely wrong. And they're saying that about the whole society.
So you've hit on a couple points, and I like the first one was this, of what about societies that you would disagree with, that we've seen throughout history that we think that's horrible, right? There's obvious ones like Nazi Germany, but there's so many more throughout history, right? Societies that have condoned slavery, even today, right? Aborting female children, fetuses, just because they're not male, things like that. So what do you do about that? If it's societal, that it's been ingrained in you and it's this construct building up from there, how do you mitigate these disagreements? And then how do you decide who's right between the different societies, right? I think that's kind of the kicker. You're incredibly selfish if you're going to claim our society is actually right and your society is actually very wrong. And how are we going to fix this? Well, we know how that's usually fixed throughout history, right? I mean, there's an obvious one. It's just fight. Whoever wins. My boy's throwing fists back there because he gets it. And then also this, what actually binds you to that societal construct? Because that's really what it is, right? If it's just the collective of people that decides on this thing, sure it can be ingrained, that's great. But why are you actually bound to that system? Right? Can you give me something? Like what actually makes you beholden to that? Yes?
So I think humans are pretty social creatures, and
Totally.
if you go against the societal morality, you kind of get like exposed from the group.
Totally. And so that's the group reaction, but what actually makes that wrong? Would be
It's-
my question.
Not like, I don't know if it's wrong, but it's like it makes you feel wrong.
Right, so it's undesirable
Yes.
is the key. So yes, you can go against it and that's undesirable. And we'll touch on that in a second, because that's a very good point. And then the second point of what you were talking about was it can change. Right, so again, societies can change what they think is good and bad, and we've seen that in our own country, right? In a brief time, right? Things change all the time of what the norm is and what's being pushed, and we look back at our country and we say, oh, it's so horrible that we did this. Who's to say that we don't do that again, right, in 100 years, if there is another 100 years. But the idea is, yeah, so it, again, it's changeable. So I don't think societies have any way to account for objective morality. And I think actually we see this in history. The Nuremberg trial, someone might know this story better than me, so correct me, I want to say it right. But as I understand it, the Nuremberg trials, right, most of you know what that is. It's when we tried Nazi Germany, the officials, things after that. And so with them, the Nazis made an appeal. And it was a pretty good appeal. They basically said, how can you condemn and try us, you are just the bigger bully. You just won, right? But we were doing what we firmly believed was right, and you were doing what you firmly believed is right. So on what basis can you actually condemn us as being wrong? And they're basically trying to show the Allied forces of just, you're like us, right? You're just the bigger bully. You just won. You had the bigger guns. And so you get to be remembered as right, while we won't. But it's not that you're actually right and we were actually wrong. And it's interesting, I believe it was the US officials, but at least some of the Allied forces basically said, yes, you're right, but we're not appealing to ourselves. We're appealing to a higher standard. And what you have done has been crimes against God and all of humanity because of the divine orders he has set out. That this is not just we think it's wrong, this is wrong, always and forever. What you tried to do to the Jews, the other things you have done, and that was their appeal. And so I think it's interesting that we've even seen that come up in the past. So what about majority? Right, so we talked about the society, and this is very, very deeply connected, of course. But what if the majority decides? Most people, so not in the bounds of society, but just most people. What are some of the problems with this, if there are some?
Still subjective.
Okay, so still subjective in what way?
Like, I feel like it can still change throughout time. Even
Okay.
if it's, I mean, if you, yeah, like it can still change. It's still based on people's opinions. Even though it's the majority of people's opinions, we've seen, I think, majorities be wrong in the past 3 years.
Or at least what we say is wrong by majority
Yeah,
now.
you're right. Yeah.
Right, so yes, it can change very quickly.
That's what I was going at. How are we defining majority? Is it a majority of people alive today?
Right.
Or a majority of people who have ever lived?
Right, is it majority, when does someone become important enough to actually have a valuable opinion in morality? Is it 6-year-olds, is it infants? Right, like if you grouped all 8-year-olds in the world and had them decide on morality, it would be terrifying. Right? You don't wanna see that system. Yes, Squire?
And then the question is, how do we pick? If you pick in a way that is either arbitrary, or if you pick in a way that you desire, you're now the authority because you're the one picking, not because it's
Right.
the majority that's said.
That's a great point. That's a great point. And so, yes, for the same reasons, and again, right, what I'm saying is, not do people often try to get morality from here? Or does it like work, or is it effective for the system? It's, is this actually where objective morality can come from? I think absolutely not. I think that seems obvious to us, right? So was slavery fine until it wasn't? If you really wanna go into semantics, there's more slaves than ever today, right, than at any point of human history. So is it still okay? Or like how many people today would agree with that or not? Right, the common other examples, right? We see aborting female children, not giving certain people's rights, and it's the definition of minorities, right? So are minority rights not important until they become the majority? Is that wrong? Is that right? How do we decide? Again, right, it's just still a construct, right? So it's arbitrary. You're just appealing to this thing, but there's no actual innate reason why we appeal to it or what actually makes us bound to it. It's changeable, it's subjective. So what about another one? Contributes to human flourishing. This is interesting. Because this seems, the first two are probably like, yes, of course, that's not when you get objective morality. But what about this one? Is it always right to go for human flourishing? Is that somewhere where we might find objective morality grounded without God? Yes, Cole.
What makes a human more valuable than any other animal?
Okay, that's a huge point. So why humans specifically? Anything else?
How do you define flourishing?
That's a great question. And that's really important. All throughout history, there have been different definitions of flourishing, right? Our mind always goes to Hitler, but he had a very concrete definition of flourishing. In fact, he lined it out more than most people, right? He lined out this entire plan of what flourishing actually meant. How do we determine if he was right or wrong? And I would actually even argue, if your definition is human flourishing in a very naturalistic sense, I would press you on why can you say Hitler was wrong? Right, what he was trying to do, his definition of like purifying the gene pool, getting rid of the undesirables, right, looking for what genetic attributes are most desirable for passing on and survival in these things, that was his whole goal, right? So why would that be wrong? Don't get me wrong, it is wrong, there's a lot of wrongs, but why? Well, how can we say that? And then why humans over any But yeah, why humans, right? It always comes at the expense of other things. And I would even say, why even in species? Why is the flourishing of humans more important than the flourishing of oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere? We use that up sometimes. Right? Like, what actually ascribes value to that? Because I'd say we're probably a little biased, right? So, okay, now here is, I think, the important one that we talk about a lot. So, what if morals are derived from evolutionary processes? Michael Ruse says we are genetically determined to believe that we ought to help one another. Okay? So, before we actually start this, I'm going to say something. So, there is an argument, and you'll see people make this, that as we understand natural selection and the evolutionary process, the traits and the values, in a sense, that we see throughout human history, many of them, or some of them at least, couldn't be defined from evolutionary processes only. They wouldn't have been made prominent, right, and selected as more desirable and pushed for the survival and passing on the genes of the human species. And some people make that argument, and they point at certain traits where they say, no, you wouldn't get this from an evolutionary framework. This would be pushed down, and we can see that in the animal world. But there's a difference with humans, and so why do we value this or that? I actually am not going to go that route. I actually think that's less fruitful, because that's not my goal this evening. My goal is not to say, no, we couldn't get that from here. My goal is to say, is this a framework from which you could get objective morality? What we're looking for. And I say, certainly not. So what can evolutionary processes account for? Even if, right, I say, okay, right, you can have that point. Every single ethic that humans typically subscribe to is just a product, or could be a product of natural selection. Here's what that can account for. It accounts for moral sentiments. It accounts for a psychology of moral traits being created. It accounts for moral feelings, right, being promoted over time and highlighted and reinforced. This is from Michael Shermer, who's the founder of The Skeptic magazine. It's a prominent atheist magazine. Obviously not the most friendly towards God and the arguments for him. And he writes a big long thing on morality, and here's some of the phrases he uses of why it's obvious how we got our moral sentiments and how it became that we have this psychology of moral traits. Well, I'm saying that's all that naturalism can account for. Not true good or bad, not true right or wrong, just chemical imbalances in your brain that you have been programmed through thousands of generations to feel. So when someone gets killed, there's nothing that actually truly makes that wrong. I simply have a reaction, right? I have been trained in my incredibly advanced computer brain to feel a certain imbalance of chemicals when this happens, so that I don't want that to happen again. So you can argue for what you feel and how that's reinforced, but it cannot argue for a true moral system, an objective moral system. And so you could say, well, I just don't think there is one, right? I think these moral feelings have just been derived throughout history of evolution. And that's fine, but then you can't, we're back to that moral subjectivity slide of all the problems there, of how do you make moral judgments, and is there actually any value or purpose to it all? Additionally, and we're going to get into some of the more implications there, we run into an agent causation problem under naturalism. What is that? Who knows what that is?
You make a self-determined choice to do something or not do something.
Right. Exactly. So you are making the self-determined choice, but I don't think that fits within the naturalistic framework. Because what it really then is, and I know this is basically determinism, which many people would argue you don't get from atheism, we'll talk about that in a second. But you are just a product of this really, really long chain of dominoes going all the way back, right? Your brain is inputs and outputs. And so lots of these inputs have gone in, you can get the outputs. And so how can I condemn someone? They're just doing what the inputs have programmed them to do and the outputs. And so where does this idea of my agent and my choice and my causing come from? I don't think you can get that. And so I think there's a lot of problems as we're looking at this just naturalistic framework for morality, right? Survival of the species in the flourishing of them. Again, we're kind of back to the one we just talked about before. Who decides what flourishing is? I think a lot of the ethics we have, and this is kind of back to the first point, right? Might go against what actually would be most conducive to the flourishing of the human species if it's defined over what evolutionary processes would promote, right? Namely survival and passing on your genes in the most efficient and effective way possible. But here's this next point. And let me be clear and honest on this. There are many atheists who would firmly and vehemently disagree with me. So I want to be fair about that, right? This isn't just a universally accepted thing. Everyone's like, duh. But I am very convinced, and there are very brilliant atheists who would be convinced with me, that logical and consistent atheism must always lead to nihilism and determinism. I think it must. And that's a whole other talk in of itself. So if you want to talk about that more after, I'd be happy to. But I do think that the spiral of logic and atheism is you're leading to nihilism because it leads to moral relativism, and you strip all moral values of their weight, and then you basically lose purpose and value to any of these things. There's just desired outcomes, but nothing actually makes those good. You've just been programmed to want those desired outcomes, but you lose the weight behind that, and determinism, what we talked about before, of everything must just flow, right? It's a long chain of dominoes. So there's no real you, right? You often hear the jokes about that, right? Like the illusion of free will or the illusion of self. But I think under this framework, that's what it is. There's no actual you in a sense of that. You're just a meat machine. It's pretty highly advanced, and it knows how to process these inputs and outputs to do what it's been programmed to do by not feeling and unthinking processes. And I'd say without God, a moral framework will always lead to might makes right. You've probably heard that phrase before, but I think if you don't have God to ground objective morality in, it must lead to might makes right. Whoever wins gets to decide what is continued. And now there might be other factors with that, right? Things that we're programmed to always desire more than others. But at the end of the day, how do you navigate moral conflicts, right? How do you decide which society is right? Or which one is really the best moral framework? It's just who's ever the strongest, right? Whoever wins, in a sense. And that's pretty grim. But many people are willing to say that. Talk to many people today who are willing to say that. Just, yeah, that's just the unfortunate reality of it. It's just whoever's strongest gets to decide. And I'd say, are you comfortable with that? Do you think that's true? Richard Dawkins, he makes this point that morals are always clearly changing. And he says it very strongly. He basically makes the case, it's very interesting. I've watched a number of podcasts and videos and stuff from him, and they'll always ask him, right? You always have this, not to be rude, but like smaller name podcast host who wants to ask the big name. So he's like, Richard, tell us where morality comes from. And Richard Dawkins always has the same answer, and I'm not going to try and impersonate him because it would just sound mean, but he sounds way cooler and smarter than me because he's British. But he makes the case that it is a profoundly difficult question. That's profoundly difficult. And I don't think, we can perfectly answer where the morals come from. And then he always adds this next point, but it's clearly not religion. He fits that in and he says, because we see that they're always changing. So you clearly don't get them from religion because they have changed throughout time. And that's an obvious, unchanging fact. So the question is that true? And I would say we have to make a distinction here that's really important when we're talking about morality. Is not to confuse what we're talking about. Is it sociology that we're describing and trying to figure out, or is it just a basis for morality? So sociology is essentially how cultures act based on how they interpret these right or wrongs. Okay, but morality is what actually is that right or wrong. And is there a basis for that, and what is the underlying truth there? Sociology is how that's enacted throughout history, how that's changed, what that looks like. So let me give an example. I gave this last time, and I kind of forgot the actual peoples, and I always do. So if you know it, tell me. But essentially, paraphrasing the story, there's two cultures in human history that had different ways of treating their dead. So one, when they died, they would burn them. So they'd make a pyre, right? And they'd send them out in the sense of a blaze of glory. One last honor, to burn the remains and have this kind of glorious send-off. Whereas another culture nearby would get rid of their dead by just putting them out for nature. Just lying them out maybe on a hillside or on a mountain slope or something, and give it back to nature, right? Their nutrients, let the animals have them, the birds, those things, to let them be helpful even in death, right? And so these cultures saw one another and were talking with one another, and they were appalled at one another, right? Because the one said, "You burn your dead?" Right? Like, what do you mean when you're saying, "Oh, we don't want their body to waste away," and it seems undignified? Like, you're wasting their body. Like, think about what's left. You can't even let them be helpful after they died. And then the other group was appalled and said, "What you're doing is awful. You just have grandma die and then send her out for the birds to peck? Like, that's terrible. That's brutal. Like, that's just so degrading to that corpse. Like, how could you do that?" So they disagreed vehemently on this. But what is the underlying moral principle that stayed the same?
Honor the dead.
Honor the dead. So they had different ways of doing this and why they thought that was good, and different approaches of what made them think that was good, right? Whether it was more utilitarian or something else, and you want to benefit the most or you want the most meaning behind it. And there's so many different ways that you can go into depth of thinking about that, right? And why people might approach it this way and why people might approach it that way. And that's a whole field of study that I am not a professional in. I will say that, right? Like I'm not. But that's not the point to me. The point is, has the underlying moral value that humans are ascribing to, has that changed throughout history? And I would say most of them, basically all of them, no. I don't think so. And that's a bold statement, and I do want to be clear. I don't think it's a perfect one-to-one. I don't think, and maybe you can, and I just haven't done the proper work, but I don't think I can just lay out these 6 values and truths that every person ever has held to as good, and they just have different ways of thinking about doing this thing. I don't think it's that obvious. It's not a perfect one-to-one ratio, but I do think throughout history, we see consistency in humanity of upholding certain values and disagreeing on how to interpret those values or how best to apply them, right, and show them, but the values remain unchanged. An example today that's interesting is cannibal tribes still exist. And there's a group of people who learned from and studied and basically interviewed a cannibal tribe, I can't remember where, but they learned something that was interesting. Even through generations of cannibalism and promoting this, they still, when they would eat human flesh, would do extensive purification rituals after. Because they knew it was wrong. And so they didn't just say, "This has become right." They knew eating your own was wrong. And so they had ways to try and bypass that and make it better. And I think that's what we see throughout history. To do horrible moral acts on a grand scale, you have to bypass that moral value. And that's what we see. What is the most common one of all? It's always dehumanization. How could the Nazis do such atrocious things to the Jews and think it was good? Well, because they bypass this. They know it's wrong to kill a human who's innocent, deserving, but Jews aren't humans. They're not people. Like, come on, what are you talking about? Right? Like, that was their thought process. So you have to bypass these certain things to then change how you're perceiving, well, enacting this isn't actually wrong. Same with slavery, right? Chattel slavery in America. The idea was, I'm not going to treat my fellow white man like this, but come on. Like that, you have to bypass that system to do horrible, unthinkable, and atrocious acts. And across cultures, this is the argument from C.S. Lewis. And I think it's a strong argument, but he makes the point that across cultures throughout history, we see extremely similar and these same underlying moral values. Even though they've never come in contact with one another, right? Things like this, and their societies have changed so much over time. No society has ever said it's good to double cross your family. No society has ever said it's good, it is morally good to abandon your allies in war. Right? So those things continue to not change throughout history. And now, going back to the main question at hand, you have to give an account for them. And so one account could be, well, the cannibals thought that eating people was wrong, and you don't double cross your family, and you don't turn away from your allies in war, because those are not profitable or desirable for the outcomes, right, of natural selection and the evolutionary process. You have been ingrained to think that those things are bad because they are not efficient nor effective for reaching the desired goal. And that could be, but again, we don't have true good and evil then. You have to say, no good and evil, right? Just chemical imbalances in my opinions. Or if it is from God, and that he has given us a conscience that knows these things are right and wrong, then I think that's a way to account for this similarity throughout history, and that's the case that C.S. Lewis makes. And so that was the question, right? Have fundamental morals really changed? I think no. I don't think it is what Richard Dawkins says. I would disagree with him. I would say I don't think the morals have clearly changed throughout history. I think sociologies, or just the studying sociology, shows you there's a lot of differences in how cultures enact these things, but the underlying values have not drastically changed throughout history. So, sort of to summarize this whole talk, here's the reminder of the moral argument. I think there are two internally consistent options. And for some people, this is frustrating, right? If you believe God exists and you really want to prove that, sometimes you want just this one-way path of no other options. But that's not really what the moral argument is. We're talking internal consistency. You can arrive at two places and only two places. One, there is no God, and therefore there is no objective morality. No standard for it. There is no true good and evil, and no standard to which I'm held. Interestingly, at least not, right, this true authoritative standard. I can create that standard for myself. Or there is a God, therefore there is objective morality. There is true right and wrong in the world, and there's a standard to which we are all held. These are the two options. And I think it's good to get people to one of these two sides. That's the whole goal. And obviously, my goal is to get someone to here. But if you end there, I think it's just, does that sit right with you? Right? As a Christian, I would argue it shouldn't. I think the law, right, is written on our hearts, and we know, even if we try to suppress it, that there is God out there and that there is good and evil. And so you just want to put a pebble in people's shoes like that, so that the next time something comes up that we're morally outraged at, you have to think to yourself, well, can I actually condemn that? Or is that just personal opinion? Or is that just the chemicals in my brain firing?
I feel like the wordings of these phrases should be reversed, because I think it is possible to have a God who never set a standard for morality.
And so that's,
And I think it should be switched. If you say there is an objective morality, then there has to be a God. And if you say there is no objective morality, then there has to not be a God.
I see what you're saying. You would say that premise
Yeah.
first. I would actually disagree. And I think that's where we kind of come back to the Euthyphro dilemma. I'd say the definition of God, that's why I think this argues for a theistic God, that if this God exists, and this is bringing in other arguments like the ontological and Kalam cosmological argument, if this God exists, the morality must be grounded in his character, or else it can't be grounded in anything else. And I don't think we would have a being that fills the requirements of this creation and the being, basically to be a necessary being and all that entails. I don't think you would have that.
So you're saying if there was a being who didn't create an objective moral framework, he wouldn't be God?
I would, yes,
Okay.
I personally would say so.
Okay.
But that's an interesting point, and so that could be fair. And it doesn't change, right, the
Sure.
point of the argument, because the whole point is if you think there are objective. So that's a very interesting point. I would, though, off a gut reaction, say I don't think that's possible.
Okay.
Yes, Carl?
Well, so I think there is a third option.
Okay.
I think Cole was hinting at it a little bit. And that is, there could be a God, but it's a God who is capricious.
Interesting, right.
Kind
Kind of the evil god.
So, well, not necessarily an evil God, but all the gods of ancient Near East were very capricious. They were constantly changing their mind, and they couldn't even decide what was right and wrong, right?
Right.
But where that leaves you is to not have any objective morality.
Right.
And so I think the qualifier needs to be, it's not just that any God exists, but it throws us to the ontological argument,
Right.
where we're saying that there is a God who is essentially good in and of himself. And if that God exists, then we have an objective morality.
And I do think that's a fair point, and I think I realized, Cole, as I was answering that, I'm bringing in attributes that are necessary, but by other arguments.
Right.
So I think what you say might be fair of just purely from the moral framework, that third option certainly could be possible. That's interesting. But for sake of time, I'll include this just really quick. With with talking about this, I would actually say this, don't be afraid of using extreme examples. Why do I say this? I say most people, I would say it's often that we see Hitler and the Nazis, which I brought up a gazillion times tonight.
Got her
As-
jaw.
What do you say? That's the one. We see them as kind of a one-time event. Like, yeah, but that was kind of in a league of its own. But no, right? If you know anything about history, you know that's not true. There are countless, and here's two other really big ones, but there are so many examples throughout human history to find atrocious and horrible events on societal or just large scale. Go ahead, Grant.
One thing that I think could really, along this line, could really potentially hit home with a lot of people is like the Civil War, like over even our own national question of slavery we
Right.
had to confront. Like, if you don't believe in an objective morality, then how dare the Abraham Lincoln put out the Emancipation Proclamation?
Right, yeah.
How dare the Union attempt to force its morality upon the Confederacy? Like, that's violating their rights per se. If there is no objective morality and it is not fundamentally wrong to enslave somebody else.
Right. So yeah, I think that just is this point of I would press people on how can you truly say that these people were wrong? Because I believe I can, confidently. It's not a question of I didn't like Pol Pot and what he did, so I'm gonna say that's wrong. I think he stands condemned under what we all are held under for being evil, horrible. The acts he did, horrific. And I can say with confidence that was evil and condemned. Because I have a standard for that. So I think it's good to press people. And again, doing this with gentleness and respect. What's the wrong way to do it is to instantly be like, well, how you can't condemn Hitler? You like Hitler. You're a fan of Hitler. Like, no. Wrong. So be loving, be gentle, right? Care for the person. But I do think it is important to press these ideas of can you really condemn these acts?
So that's Pol Pot and who's
Pol
Mr.
Pot
Mustache?
and Stalin.
Stalin, okay.
Stalin in Russia. So two large figures who have done a lot of evil, right, and spearheaded a lot of evil. I'm gonna skip the Hitchens challenge for now. It's a fun one. If you want to hear it after, we can talk about it. It's a challenge, really, that Christopher Hitchens issued to Christian apologists everywhere. Of can you answer this? And it's a little bit tangential, which is why I'm not going to include it. But it's interesting. So if you want to hear that, we can talk about it after. If not, people want. So in review, final point. Here's the argument. Here's what I covered tonight. If God does not exist, objective moral duties and values cannot exist. They just can't. But objective moral duties and values do exist, and you have to decide, do you think that's true or not? And therefore, God does exist. And I'd say from the Christian framework, not only does God exist, but we get to live righteously. We don't just know the moral framework, but we have access to live righteously, to have confidence in that, to be reconciled to God through his Son, through the gospel. So that is the moral argument in a nutshell. I think those are its strengths, those are its weaknesses. That's as far as it can take you. So know the tool you're using. We'll end, and then, so I won't have like a public time for questions, which is a bit of a bummer, sorry. But please ask questions after. I'm happy to talk and discuss, and if you have objections, bring them up. I want to talk through them. But that's all. Thank you. I appreciate it. I'll just actually announce this now. Psych, I'm back! I was gonna have Cole do it, but I think I forgot to tell him. Next week is not me, thankfully, you're spared. It is going to be John Huckstep. Who's been here before. Dr. John Huckstep. He's been here before. He was great. If you were here for the talk on aging, biology before, that was him. Only a few people in the room who might have been to that. But he's super good. He's a friend of Daryl Doyama's, so he's going to be here next week, and his talk is on biology, intelligent design, and the cardiovascular system. So that's kind of his specialty. He goes into a lot of depth. So if nothing else, if you're a fan of science, come to hear super duper epic heart science, which has been his life's work. But he talks through all that and does that point to a designer. So should be super interesting. Additionally, we will be whiteboarding again in 2 weeks. So that, October 7th. So next week is September 30th, that's John. October 7th, we'll be whiteboarding. So stay posted. Really appreciate all of you that came out to whiteboarding today. who were discussing, some of you who just came and answered the question. Really appreciate it. That's the whole goal, right, of this club, is to begin those discussions, to have those dialogues. So props to you if you kind of overcame your fears and did it, and props to you if you had those discussions and then came to this meeting. Really grateful for it. I am going to pray us out, and then you're totally free. Thank you for hanging in for so long. I know an hour and a half is not short, but hopefully it was worth your time. All right, dear Lord, thank you for this evening. Thank you for each person here. You brought them here for a reason, so we thank you for this opportunity. I do pray that whatever I said that was true, that is consistent with your truth, that it would stick, that it would impact people, that you would work through it. If I said anything that is not true, if I'm deceived in any of these, please just wipe it away. Let nobody remember it. Let it just fall between the cracks of our minds, and show me what is true in all of us here. We want to know you, and we believe your way is the best. So we praise you for everything. Give us strength in the coming weeks and days at school. Help us to love and support those around us and to be a light here on campus. And in your name we pray. Amen.
Eat food.
Yes, there's a lot of baked goods, thanks to our new club mom. The Hitchens, Lemma. I'm Joe. Jones, nice to meet you, sir. Yes.
You already know.
Yes.
God exists? I did, I heard that.
I'm really glad I just.
Did you go to Luke's talks over the summer?
Some of them in Nigeria.
So is that.
Honest, that was really good for me. So good for me.
Imagine that. So you are really a morning person, apparently.
I would